A small basket waited beneath the porch light, its blanket trembling in the winter wind. Inside, an abandoned German Shepherd puppy stared up at Navy SEAL Luke Bennett, too weak to stand, yet strong enough to cling to his uniform. Beside the puppy lay a cold bottle, a blue ribbon, and a warning. Please don't take him back to Miller Creek. Who had left him there? Why did the sound of a passing truck fill the puppy with fear? And when tiny paw prints began leading toward an abandoned kennel, would Luke discover another life still waiting to be found? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late winter lay quietly over Lake Bluff, Illinois, where wind pushed loose snow across the streets and the houses near Naval Station Great Lakes glowed against a pale evening sky. Luke Bennett's small rental remained dark until his truck turned into the driveway. Luke was 39, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cut dark brown hair, gray at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard that sharpened his square jaw. His blue eyes carried the alertness of a Navy SEAL trained to notice what others missed. 3 years earlier, a mission had ended without 2 members of his team coming home. Since then, Luke had remained patient with trainees, dependable with strangers, and distant from anyone who might ask what he needed. He stepped from the truck in his Navy working uniform Type 3 and reached for his duffel. Then he noticed an old wicker laundry basket beneath the porch light. One handle was broken and wrapped with gray tape. A faded blue blanket covered the inside, but the fabric trembled in short, uneven movements. Luke approached carefully. 2 oversized ears appeared beneath the blanket, one half raised and the other folded toward a small black and tan head. A German Shepherd puppy, perhaps 7 weeks old, stared up at him with dark brown eyes, too solemn for such a young face. The puppy's coat was dirty around the paws and chest, and his body felt frighteningly light when Luke slipped a hand beneath him. Beside the puppy lay a plastic bottle filled with cold milk and a folded piece of notebook paper. The rushed handwriting read, "Please don't take him back to Miller Creek. I didn't know who else to trust." There was no name. Luke searched the empty street, but no car moved and no figure waited beneath the bare trees. Anger rose first. Someone had left a helpless animal outside in freezing weather and called it trust. Yet beneath the anger was a harder question. Whoever had come here knew where Luke lived and believed a man trained for dangerous missions would know how to save something too small to stand. The puppy tried anyway. His front legs straightened, his hindquarters lifted, and then his body folded against Luke's wrist. Luke carried the basket inside with one arm and held the puppy against his chest with the other. The house was clean and temporary. A gray sofa, a plain table, bare walls, and nothing that could not be packed in minutes. Luke turned up the heat, warmed a towel in the dryer, and wrapped the puppy carefully. The heartbeat beneath his palm was rapid and delicate. Luke had treated injured men in worse conditions, but the puppy's helplessness unsettled him differently. A soldier could explain where the pain was. This creature could offer only trembling and trust, and Luke had never found trust easy to carry. He called the nearest veterinary clinic. While the emergency line connected, the puppy watched his face as if memorizing it. "Stay with me," Luke murmured, surprised by the softness in his voice. The veterinary assistant instructed him to keep the puppy warm, offer nothing more until a veterinarian examined him, and bring him in immediately. Luke repeated every instruction with military precision. Before leaving, he took a photograph for his younger sister, Sarah Bennett. Sarah was 35, tall and slender, with shoulder-length chestnut hair, fair, freckled skin, and Luke's blue eyes softened by humor. A second-grade teacher in Milwaukee, Sarah had become practical during their mother's long illness, without becoming hard. She also recognized Luke's feelings before he admitted having any. Luke held the puppy against his chest and extended the phone. At that moment, the puppy opened his mouth in a breathy yawn that looked almost like a cheerful grin. Luke raised his eyebrows in surprise. The photograph captured a large Navy SEAL looking completely unprepared beside a tiny German Shepherd who appeared delighted with the arrangement. Luke sent it with 4 words. "Found this on Porch." Sarah replied almost at once. "Correction, he found you." Luke stared at the message longer than necessary. The words unsettled him because they sounded like a joke and a truth at the same time. Luke had spent years believing that being needed was different from being loved. Missions needed him. Trainees needed his experience. His commanders needed his discipline. None of those things required him to stay after the work was finished. The puppy nudged Luke's chin with a cold nose, and for one brief second, the silent house felt less like a place Luke was borrowing. Across the street, Margaret Lawson had watched from behind lace curtains. Maggie was 76, short and softly built, with silver hair curled around a round face and calm gray eyes shaped by 42 years as a pediatric nurse. She had once soothed frightened children and anxious parents with effortless patience. Then her husband Frank died 18 months earlier, and grief narrowed her world. Maggie stopped volunteering, stopped inviting neighbors for coffee, and avoided situations where anyone might need her. She was not afraid of work. She was afraid that caring for someone new meant agreeing to another goodbye. At Maggie's feet stood Rosie, her 11-year-old golden retriever. Rosie had a cream-colored coat, a silvered muzzle, and patient brown eyes shaped by years of visiting hospital rooms with Maggie. Age had slowed her steps and stiffened her back legs, but it had not weakened her instinct for distress. The old dog pressed close to the glass and whined as Luke hurried through the house with the basket. Maggie rested a hand on Rosie's head. "We are not getting involved." Rosie looked up with the gentle disbelief of someone who had heard an obvious lie. Maggie tried to turn away from the window. She told herself Luke was capable, the veterinary clinic was nearby, and a puppy was not her responsibility. Yet the old habits of a nurse had already awakened. She had noticed the puppy's trembling, the way Luke supported the small body, and the urgency in his movements. Concern moved through Maggie like warmth returning to a long, total room. She resented it almost as much as she welcomed it. Minutes later, Luke stepped outside, carrying the puppy beneath his coat and balancing the basket against one hip. The puppy's head emerged beside Luke's collar, ears trembling in the cold. Luke had nearly reached the truck when the tiny animal lifted one front paw and hooked it into the fabric at his neck. The grip was weak but stubborn. Luke stopped and looked down. The puppy clung to him as though one small paw could keep the whole world from disappearing again. Something tightened behind Luke's ribs. He had seen frightened men hold photographs, letters, and pieces of fabric with the same desperate faith. Those objects had never been valuable by themselves. Their value came from what they represented. The promise that somewhere beyond fear, a person or a place still waited. Maggie was already crossing the street with Rosie beside her. Snow settled on her dark wool coat, and concern had replaced hesitation in her face. Rosie walked carefully across the icy pavement, never taking her eyes from the bundle beneath Luke's coat. Maggie studied Luke, then the tiny paw caught in his uniform collar. "Looks like he's already decided who's responsible," she said. Snow still drifted across Lake Bluff when Luke Bennett carried the German Shepherd puppy into North Shore Veterinary Clinic. The waiting room was nearly empty, washed in pale light and the faint smell of disinfectant. Luke sat with the puppy tucked inside his coat, one hand around the small ribcage. Every breath felt too fast. Every pause felt too long. He had spent years learning how to measure danger without showing fear, yet the life against his chest was so fragile that control seemed almost dishonest. Dr. Rachel Kim entered with a stethoscope around her neck. She was 42, slender, with straight black hair cut at her jaw, warm brown eyes, and the steady hands of someone who never rushed frightened animals. A pale scar crossed her right thumb, left by a terrified rescue dog early in her career. The injury had made her more patient, not more distant. Rachel examined the puppy's gums, paws, abdomen, heart, and lungs. "He's dehydrated and underweight," she said, "but his heart is strong and his lungs are clear." Luke released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Rachel estimated the puppy was about 7 weeks old. He had gone too long without proper food, and his body temperature had fallen dangerously low. She gave him warmed fluids and explained that the next 24 hours mattered. He needed warmth and very small feedings every 2 hours, even through the night. Too much at once could make him sick. Too little would leave him without enough strength to recover. Luke wrote down quantities, temperatures, warning signs, and the correct feeding position. Rachel watched him fill half a page. "You don't have to make this perfect," she said. "You have to make it gentle and consistent." Gentle and consistent sounded simple. For Luke, simple things were often the hardest. Missions had clear objectives and defined endings. Care repeated itself quietly, long after courage stopped looking impressive. By the time Luke returned home, the storm had softened. Maggie met him at the porch with Rosie beside her and a canvas bag over one arm. She had packed clean towels, a heating pad, and a kitchen scale. Behind them came Henry, Maggie's 9-year-old orange tabby. Henry was broad through the middle with amber eyes, a torn tip on his left ear, and the offended walk of an animal who believed every closed door was a personal insult. Maggie claimed Henry disliked dogs. Henry's habit of following Rosie everywhere suggested otherwise. Luke cleared the coffee table and turned the living room into a temporary care station. Towels stood in straight rows. A notebook held feeding times and weight checks. Alarms were set every 2 hours. Maggie watched him arrange bottles and cloths with military precision. "You know babies rarely respect charts," she said. "This one hasn't seen the chart yet. That has never stopped a baby." Luke warmed the formula exactly as Rachel had instructed, tested a drop against his wrist, and wrapped the puppy in a towel. The puppy sniffed the bottle, turned away, and buried his nose in Luke's sleeve. Luke adjusted the temperature. The puppy refused. He changed his hold. Nothing. Finally, Luke used the calm command voice he gave nervous trainees. "All right, little man. We're going to complete this 1 ounce at a time." The puppy blinked and looked toward the sofa. Maggie covered a smile. Perhaps he objects to being enlisted. Irritation flickered through Luke, followed immediately by shame. The puppy was not being difficult. He was frightened, exhausted, and surrounded by unfamiliar smells. Luke understood fear when it appeared in silence, rigid shoulders and watchful eyes. He had simply failed to recognize it in a body small enough to fit inside a laundry basket. Maggie sat on the rug. "Put him near Rosie." Rosie lowered herself beside the basket with a soft groan from her aging hips. Her cream-colored body curved around the puppy without touching him. She rested her silvered muzzle against the blanket and breathed slowly. Henry settled several feet away, tail wrapped around his paws, wearing an expression of formal disapproval. Yet whenever the puppy made a weak sound, the cat's ears turned toward him. The puppy lifted his head, smelled Rosie, and crawled closer. Her warmth filled the space between them. Luke sat beside the basket and offered the bottle again, this time without speaking. The puppy licked one drop, then another. His mouth closed around the nipple, and he began to drink in small, uncertain pulls. Luke's shoulders eased. Maggie watched the tiny throat move and felt something loosen inside her. For decades, she had known how to enter a frightened child's world without forcing the door. After Frank died, she had convinced herself that gift belonged to a life already finished. Now it returned, not as a wound, but as proof that part of her had survived. "He needed another heartbeat," Maggie said. "I was holding him." "Yes," she replied gently, "but you were also trying very hard not to be afraid." The words struck closer than Luke expected. "Fear makes people careless." "Sometimes. Sometimes it makes them careful in all the wrong ways." Luke looked at the puppy drinking beside Rosie. He understood what Maggie meant. He had spent years believing that vigilance could protect him from every kind of loss. It had protected his body, perhaps, but it had also made his life orderly, empty, and easy to abandon. The puppy finished only a little before falling asleep. Luke recorded the time and amount in the notebook. Maggie offered to return for the midnight feeding. Luke began to object, remembering that she had avoided responsibility since Frank's death, but Maggie had already taken the empty bottle from his hand. "I'm volunteering for the least glamorous night shift in Illinois," she said. Luke studied her face. The grief was still there, quietly settled around her eyes, but so was something else. A small sense of purpose that had not been present when she crossed the street earlier. "You should get some rest," he said. "So should you. I'm trained to stay awake. And I raised 3 children while working hospital nights. Your qualifications do not frighten me." At midnight, Maggie returned in a blue cardigan beneath her coat. Rosie followed obediently, while Henry slipped through the doorway before anyone could stop him. The cat walked into Luke's living room as though arriving to inspect property he had recently acquired. The next feeding went more smoothly. Rosie lay beside the basket, her body forming a warm wall around the puppy. Henry settled near the heating pad, pretending warmth was his only concern. When the puppy whimpered, Henry leaned forward, sniffed one oversized ear, and then withdrew with the solemn dignity of a physician who had completed an examination. Luke held the bottle without forcing it. Maggie rested one hand lightly against the puppy's back. The puppy drank steadily, his paws flexing against the towel. For several minutes, the room contained only the soft sound of swallowing, Rosie's slow breathing, and the occasional ticking of the kitchen clock. Luke had always thought silence was something empty. That night, silence felt occupied. When the bottle was empty, Luke set it aside. The puppy wriggled free, crawled across the blanket, and reached Luke's black military boot. With enormous effort, he climbed onto the toe, circled once, and fell asleep with his chin across the laces. Luke looked at Maggie. "I think I just lost a shoe." Maggie smiled, and for the first time in many months, the expression reached her eyes. "No," she said. "You just got adopted." Morning arrived, bright and brittle over Lake Bluff, with sunlight flashing across the snowbanks and bare branches tapping softly against Luke Bennett's kitchen window. Inside the rental house, order had begun losing a quiet battle against one 7-week-old German shepherd. Luke had moved the coffee table, blocked the hallway with 2 storage boxes, and arranged a temporary enclosure from folding panels borrowed from the veterinary clinic. The puppy studied each obstacle with solemn brown eyes, waited until Luke looked away, and slipped through a gap no wider than Luke's hand. Luke found him beneath the dining table, chewing the corner of the feeding chart. "That document contains your entire recovery plan," Luke said. The puppy placed one oversized paw on the paper and pulled harder. Luke had seen grown men challenge instructions with less confidence. He lifted the puppy, returned him to the enclosure, and tightened the panels. 5 minutes later, a small black and tan head appeared from beneath the bottom rail. The puppy flattened his narrow body, pushed with his hind legs, and escaped again. Maggie Lawson arrived carrying a bowl of softened puppy food, while Rosie walked beside her at a patient pace. Henry followed without invitation, slipping through the doorway before Luke could close it. The orange tabby paused in the entrance, surveyed the altered room, and looked offended that someone had installed a fence without consulting him. Maggie watched the puppy crawl through the panels for a 3rd time. You could build him a steel fortress. He'd find a ventilation shaft. You keep putting him in little coops, and he keeps getting out. Maggie considered the puppy as he attacked Luke's bootlace. "Cooper." Luke glanced down. "Cooper?" The puppy stopped chewing and looked up. Maggie smiled. He answered. He responded to the sound. "That is how names usually work." Luke repeated it more softly. "Cooper." The puppy's half-raised ear twitched. Then Cooper climbed onto Luke's boot as though accepting the arrangement. Over the next several days, Cooper's strength returned faster than his manners developed. His ribs became less visible, his eyes brighter, and his steps steadier. Luke continued the feeding schedule Rachel had given him, but he began noticing that food alone did not explain Cooper's improvement. The puppy followed voices. He woke when Luke left the room. He settled only when a familiar hand rested beside him. Rosie became Cooper's first instructor. The elderly golden retriever never corrected him harshly. When Luke placed 2 bowls on the kitchen floor, Rosie sat and waited. Cooper rushed forward, skidded on the tile, and buried his nose in the wrong bowl. Rosie looked at him with patient disappointment. Luke gently moved Cooper back. "Watch her." Rosie remained seated until Luke gave permission. Cooper stared at her, then at the food, his entire body vibrating with effort. He managed to keep all 4 paws still for 3 seconds. Luke released him. Cooper charged the bowl as though 3 seconds had been a historic injustice. By the end of the week, he could wait nearly 10. Rosie also taught Cooper to follow an adult through doorways rather than sprinting blindly ahead. When they returned from short walks, she stood calmly while Maggie wiped snow and road salt from her paws. Cooper initially treated the towel as an enemy combatant. He bit it, rolled onto his back, and became tangled around one hind leg. Rosie lowered herself beside him and offered a paw without protest. Cooper watched, released the towel, and eventually allowed Luke to clean his muddy feet. Henry provided a different education. The cat demonstrated how to hook one paw beneath the door of a low kitchen cabinet. Cooper observed from inches away. Henry pulled, the cabinet opened. Inside were dish towels, paper bags, and a wooden spoon. Henry selected nothing. Knowledge appeared to be the reward. Cooper then dragged out every towel and carried one triumphantly into the living room. Henry also taught him to pull fabric from the back of the sofa, climb into places he had been forbidden to enter, and ignore Luke's voice whenever obedience seemed inconvenient. When Luke called Cooper away from an overturned basket of laundry, Henry turned his back at precisely the same moment. Cooper copied him. "I know what you're doing," Luke told the cat. Henry began washing one paw. Maggie claimed Henry was innocent. Her expression suggested she did not believe herself. The small disasters amused Luke more than he expected. His home had once been quiet enough for him to hear the refrigerator cycle from any room. Now towels migrated, toys appeared beneath furniture, and every unattended sock faced an uncertain future. Disorder should have irritated him. Instead, the evidence of another life moving through the house made the rooms feel less temporary. One afternoon, Cooper woke from a nap and found Luke outside bringing firewood from the shed. The puppy stood in the center of the empty living room and began to whine. Rosie was nearby, but Cooper searched the doorway, trembling until Luke returned. When Luke stepped inside, Cooper rushed toward him, pressed his body against Luke's boot, and did not move. Luke crouched and ran a hand along the puppy's back. Cooper did not need another meal. He needed confirmation. He needed to know that a closed door did not mean everyone had vanished. Luke understood the distinction because he had lived inside it. After losing 2 teammates, he had accepted concern from others but distrusted permanence. People said they would call, visit, or remain close. Life changed. Orders arrived. Grief made conversations uncomfortable. Eventually, silence became easier for everyone. Cooper had no philosophy for abandonment. He simply woke and looked for someone. Luke began speaking whenever he moved from room to room. "Kitchen. Laundry. Back in a minute." The words meant nothing to Cooper at first, but the tone did. Gradually, the puppy learned that Luke's footsteps leaving were often followed by Luke's footsteps returning. That same afternoon, Maggie's granddaughter visited. Abigail Lawson, known as Abby, was 28, tall and athletic, with dark blonde hair gathered in a loose braid, light olive skin, and thoughtful hazel eyes. She worked as an occupational therapist in nearby Waukegan and possessed Maggie's instinct for noticing what people avoided saying. Abby had grown close to her grandmother after Frank's death, although Maggie often resisted her help out of fear that dependence would become a burden. Abby knelt to greet Cooper, who immediately climbed into her lap and tried to steal the cord from her sweater.
"Grandma told me you had joined a rescue operation."
"I supervised," Maggie said. "You stayed here for a midnight feeding. Supervision occasionally requires inconvenient hours." Abby looked toward Rosie, whose silver muzzle rested on her paws. "The senior companionship program called again. They still want you and Rosie back." Maggie's smile faded. Before Frank's death, Maggie and Rosie had visited older residents who lived alone or rarely received family. Rosie would rest beside wheelchairs and beds while Maggie listened to stories that needed somewhere to go. Maggie had stopped after Frank's funeral. Caring for lonely people had become unbearable when she returned to an empty house afterward. "Rosie is 11, Maggie said. "Her hips are stiff. It would be foolish to begin again when we may not finish." Abby sat beside her.
"You don't have to promise forever."
"That is what people say when they want you to begin something painful." Luke heard the sharper meaning beneath Maggie's words. She was not afraid the visits would fail. She was afraid they would succeed. Rosie would become important to someone. Maggie would feel useful again. Then age, illness, or death would eventually end it. Luke did not challenge her. Some truths could not be forced open. He only watched Maggie's hand settle on Rosie's neck and saw how tightly love and fear had woven themselves together. Later, after Abby left and Maggie returned home, Luke gathered the scattered towels from the living room. Cooper chased one corner of the old wicker basket, caught it between his teeth and pulled. The broken basket tipped over. The faded blanket spilled onto the floor. Something narrow and blue slid from beneath its lining. Luke picked it up. It was a worn ribbon with a small metal clasp at one end. Embroidered across the fabric were 4 words: Miller Creek Canine Services. The moment the clasp clicked against Luke's wedding ring finger, Cooper froze. His playful expression vanished. He backed away until his body struck the corner wall, then crouched low, trembling so hard that one metal tag on the feeding station began to rattle. Luke stopped moving. The ribbon lay across his palm, suddenly heavier than cloth should ever feel. The next morning came clear and bitter over Lake Bluff, with sunlight resting on the snow like thin glass and a cold wind moving through the bare maples. Inside Luke Bennett's rental house, the blue ribbon from Miller Creek Canine Services lay inside a transparent evidence bag on the kitchen counter. Cooper would not go near it. Even from across the room, the 7-week-old German Shepherd kept his body low, one ear folded back and his dark eyes fixed on the small metal clasp as though it might spring to life. Luke had seen fear attach itself to ordinary objects before. A doorway could become a battlefield. A certain smell could bring back a room that no longer existed. A harmless sound could turn the body against the mind before reason had time to intervene. He understood that forcing Cooper toward the ribbon would not create courage. It would only teach the puppy that Luke could become part of the threat. Luke photographed the embroidery, then began searching public records and old business listings. Miller Creek Canine Services stood 11 miles west of town on a narrow rural road bordered by pine woods and abandoned farmland. The facility had once trained guard dogs for warehouses, private properties, and construction sites. Its owner, 73-year-old Harold Miller, had been hospitalized 6 weeks earlier after suffering a stroke in a grocery store parking lot. Harold was described in several old newspaper articles as a wiry man with deep-set gray eyes, a narrow white mustache, and the stern posture of someone raised to believe affection weakened working animals. He had built the business after losing his wife and spent more than 30 years breeding and training German Shepherds. Former customers called him disciplined. 2 anonymous reviews called him cruel. Neither description explained what had happened after the ambulance carried him away. Luke called the county animal control office. The woman who answered introduced herself as Denise Carter, a 54-year-old dispatcher with a low, practical voice and a habit of pausing before answering difficult questions. Denise had worked county calls for 27 years and had learned that people often lied most carefully when animals could not speak for themselves. Miller Creek was inspected after Mr. Miller went into the hospital, Denise said. The caretaker told us all the dogs had been transferred or collected by owners. Do you have records? Only the list he provided. And the caretaker's name? A pause followed. Earl Voss. Luke wrote it down. Denise explained that Earl had worked at the facility for less than a year. He was 46, broad-bodied, balding, and known around the county for avoiding eye contact whenever officials asked direct questions. No charges had been filed because the kennels appeared empty during the inspection. Denise admitted that the visit had been brief. A winter storm was approaching that day, and the officer assigned to the case had been covering 3 counties alone. So nobody confirmed where every dog went? Luke said. No, Denise replied. Regret entered her voice. We confirmed only that none were visible. After the call, Luke looked toward Cooper. The puppy lay against Rosie's front legs while the elderly golden retriever rested her silver muzzle over his back. Henry occupied the armchair nearby, round orange body balanced on the cushion, and amber eyes narrowed as though the entire investigation had failed to meet his professional standards. Luke decided that understanding the past could wait until Cooper felt safe in the present. He began with a teaspoon placed on a folded towel. Cooper watched from beside Rosie. Luke touched the spoon lightly against a ceramic bowl, producing no more than a soft tick. Cooper flinched, but Rosie did not move. Luke immediately offered a piece of softened food and spoke in the same calm tone he used during feedings. Nothing bad followed the sound. An hour later, Luke repeated it. The next day, he allowed the spoon to touch the bowl without the towel beneath it. The sound was sharper. Cooper backed away 2 steps, then looked toward Rosie. The golden retriever remained stretched across the rug, calm enough to make fear seem slightly foolish. Henry sat on the back of the sofa, tail curled around his paws, observing Luke with the solemn expression of an unpaid judge forced to attend a very slow trial. Luke progressed carefully. He clicked the front door lock from across the room. He placed a chain gently on the carpet, then later on a towel-covered table. Every sound was followed by food, quiet praise, or the reassuring presence of Rosie. He never blocked Cooper's retreat. The puppy could move closer or farther away. Choice, Luke knew, was often the first thing fear stole. On the 3rd day, Cooper approached the spoon after it touched the bowl. He sniffed it, sneezed, and looked up at Luke. That's right, Luke said. It's just a spoon. Henry jumped onto the table and knocked the spoon to the floor. The metal struck the tile with a loud clang. Cooper bolted behind the sofa. Luke closed his eyes briefly. Henry looked down at the spoon, then at Luke, without the faintest sign of remorse. Maggie, standing in the doorway with Rosie's leash, pressed her lips together to suppress a laugh. Your assistant appears to favor immersion therapy. He's been removed from the program. Henry sat down and began cleaning his shoulder. Luke did not drag Cooper from hiding. He sat on the floor several feet away and spoke about nothing important. The weather, the feeding schedule, the fact that one of his socks had disappeared again. Eventually, a small black nose appeared around the sofa. Then one paw. Cooper crossed the room cautiously and pressed against Luke's knee. The setback had not erased the progress. That mattered. Later that afternoon, Sarah called by video. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose knot, and faint freckles showed across her fair cheeks beneath the light of her apartment kitchen. She listened as Luke described Cooper's reactions, Miller Creek, the desensitization sessions, and Henry's interference. You've talked for 11 minutes, Sarah said. So? 9 of those minutes were about the puppy. He has a complicated situation. You once dated a woman for 4 months and described her to me as nice. Luke glanced toward Cooper, who was dragging a black sock through the hallway. That comparison makes no sense. Sarah smiled. You refused to buy a houseplant for 6 years because you said watering schedules created unnecessary obligations. I travel. You've spent this entire week arranging your life around a creature who eats every 2 hours and steals clothing. At that exact moment, Cooper trotted past the phone with Luke's sock hanging from his mouth like a captured flag. Sarah raised one eyebrow. Clearly, nothing has changed. Luke ended the call shortly afterward, but her observation remained. He had not consciously decided to build his days around Cooper. The changes had happened in small pieces. An alarm moved, a training session shortened, a light left on in the hallway so the puppy would not wake in darkness. Care had entered his life quietly, disguising itself as responsibility until it was too deeply rooted to remove. Across the street that evening, Maggie sat at her dining table with Rosie asleep beside her chair. The application for the senior companionship program remained open on her laptop. Her name, address, and previous volunteer experience had already been entered. Only the final confirmation button remained. Maggie placed her finger on the trackpad. She imagined Rosie resting beside an elderly stranger. She imagined conversation returning to a silent room. Then she imagined Rosie's stiff hips worsening, the visits ending, and another person learning what absence felt like. Maggie withdrew her hand. The application remained unfinished, but she did not close it. The following afternoon, Luke took Cooper into the fenced front yard for a brief training session. Snowmelt dripped from the gutters, and the road gleamed beneath a weak sun. Luke practiced simple recall, rewarding Cooper each time the puppy crossed the short distance between them. A battered dark green truck turned onto the street. Its engine produced a deep, uneven vibration. Cooper froze. Luke saw recognition replace curiosity in the puppy's face. Cooper pulled backward so suddenly that the leash slipped across Luke's glove. At the same moment, a gust of wind pushed the front gate wider. Luke reached for the lead, but Cooper twisted free, shot through the opening, and raced toward the road. "Cooper!" The puppy did not look back. The old truck continued past the house as Cooper ran toward the western edge of Lake Bluff, the road that led to Miller Creek. Cooper vanished beyond the curve before Luke reached the end of the driveway. The afternoon sun had weakened behind a sheet of gray cloud, leaving Lake Bluff in a cold, colorless light. Snowmelt ran along the gutters, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth from beneath the thinning white ground. Luke sprinted toward the road, calling Cooper's name, but the puppy did not slow. Fear had taken command of the small body, pulling him toward something remembered more clearly than Luke's voice. Maggie hurried from across the street with Rosie beside her. The 76-year-old woman had not stopped to fasten her coat properly, and her silver curls moved loose around her worried face. Rosie's stiff hips prevented her from running, but the elderly golden retriever strained forward, nose lowered toward Cooper's trail. "He went west," Luke said. Maggie saw the tension in his jaw. "Then we follow west." Luke wanted to tell her to stay home. The road was slick, the air was growing colder, and Miller Creek lay several miles beyond town. Yet Maggie had already clipped Rosie's leash and begun studying the muddy edge of the snow. Luke recognized the expression. It was the same focused calm she must once have carried into hospital rooms where frightened parents needed someone else to believe the night could be survived. Cooper's paw prints appeared intermittently along the roadside, small dark marks where the snow remained, then muddy smears across exposed gravel. Luke drove slowly with the window open, while Maggie watched from the passenger seat and Rosie stood behind them, nose lifted toward the air. Twice they lost the trail. Twice Rosie found it again. The houses thinned until only winter fields and tall pines bordered the road. A rusted sign leaned beside a narrow entrance, Miller Creek Canine Services. One chain hung loose from the gate, and tire tracks disappeared beneath old snow. Beyond it stood a low farmhouse, several rows of outdoor kennels, and a long wooden storage building with a corrugated metal roof. The property looked empty, but it did not feel abandoned. Luke had learned to distrust silence that seemed too complete. Silence often meant something was hiding, waiting, or no longer strong enough to make itself heard. They found Cooper near the last building. The puppy stood before a padlocked wooden door, scratching with both front paws and crying in short, desperate sounds. Mud covered his legs and belly. one partially raised ear pressed flat against his head. "Cooper," Luke said gently. The puppy glanced back but did not come. He turned toward the door and scratched again. From inside came a faint scrape. Rosie stopped beside Maggie and stared at the building. Her body became still except for the slow rise of her chest. Then another sound came through the wall, a weak whine, followed by a soft thump. Luke tested the lock but did not force it. The condition of the property was uncertain, and entering without support could frighten or endanger whatever was inside. He called the county sheriff's office, then contacted animal control. While they waited, he crouched near Cooper without blocking the puppy's path. "You brought us here," Luke murmured. "Now let us do the rest." Cooper stayed pressed against the door. A patrol vehicle arrived first. Deputy Mark Ellis stepped out, a 48-year-old man with a solid build, close-cropped sandy hair and a neatly trimmed reddish beard touched with gray. His weathered face appeared stern until he spoke. Mark had grown up on a dairy farm and treated frightened animals with the careful respect of someone who understood that panic could make even gentle creatures unpredictable. Years earlier, he had lost a farm dog after waiting too long to investigate an unusual sound in a barn. Since then, he took reports involving trapped animals more seriously than some colleagues considered necessary. Denise Carter arrived in the county animal control van minutes later. She was shorter than Luke expected, with broad shoulders, iron-gray hair cut close around her face, and dark eyes sharpened by years of seeing the consequences of human neglect. The practical voice Luke remembered from the telephone belonged to a woman who carried leashes, blankets, water, and bolt cutters with equal familiarity. After confirming the building belonged to Miller Creek and documenting the locked entrance, Mark cut the padlock. Denise opened the door only a few inches at first. The odor of stale straw and an unclean kennel drifted into the cold air. The room inside was dim, but Luke could see two shapes near the back wall. An adult German shepherd lay curled around a smaller puppy. The mother was perhaps 4 years old, with black and tan fur dulled by dust and a narrow body that revealed how long she had survived on too little food. One ear stood upright, while the other carried a small, old tear along its edge. Her brown eyes followed every person at the door, exhausted but fiercely alert. The second puppy appeared close to Cooper's age, though slightly larger, with dark fur across the back, tan legs, and both ears still folded. The youngster lifted his head but lacked the strength to stand. Denise entered slowly, keeping her body turned sideways. She placed water within reach and spoke in a low voice. The mother dog growled once, not with aggression, Luke thought, but with the final warning of a parent who had nothing left except the willingness to defend one child. Then Cooper slipped past Luke. He ran directly toward her. The mother's head lifted. Her expression changed before any human could have named what passed through it. Recognition softened the tension around her eyes. Cooper pressed against her face, whining, and the mother dog licked his muzzle again and again. Her tail struck the floor once, then twice. Luke felt the sight somewhere beneath his ribs. Cooper had carried the memory of her through cold nights, unfamiliar rooms, and every frightened awakening. The puppy had not been running away from Luke. He had been running back for someone who could no longer come searching for him. A movement near the pine trees drew Mark's attention. A teenage girl stood beyond the kennels. She wore a faded green parka, worn jeans, and boots caked with mud. Emma Collins was 17, slender and slightly tall, with pale skin reddened by the cold, long brown hair escaping from beneath a knitted cap, and wide hazel eyes that looked prepared to flee. She lived with her father on a small property half a mile away. Her mother had left when Emma was 9, leaving the girl with a deep suspicion of promises and a fierce instinct to protect anything weaker than herself. Emma held a canvas bag filled with canned dog food. Denise recognized her from the nearby address records. "Have you been feeding them?" Emma nodded but remained near the trees. "Through the gap behind the building. Earl stopped coming weeks ago. I thought someone else would come." "Why didn't you call?" Mark asked. "I did, once. I hung up."
Her eyes moved toward Luke. I took the smaller puppy when he crawled through the loose board. The mother wouldn't leave the other one. She wouldn't let me carry her. Luke understood before she finished. You left Cooper on my porch. Emma's chin trembled. I saw you helping Mrs. Lawson with groceries during the last storm. You were wearing your uniform. I thought you wouldn't ignore him. She looked down. I didn't knock because I was afraid you'd call the police.
My dad says people only notice mistakes after you try to help. Luke could have told her how dangerous the decision had been. Cooper might have frozen. The note had delayed the truth. 2 animals had remained trapped because Emma had tried to carry the entire burden alone. But anger would only teach her to hide better next time. You did one brave thing, Luke said. You got him out. Emma looked up. Then you let fear finish the job, he continued. Kindness needs enough courage to ask for help, or it can become another dangerous secret. Emma lowered her eyes, but she nodded. Denise and Mark prepared the mother dog and the remaining puppy for transport. The mother tried to stand, failed, and accepted the blanket stretcher only after Cooper remained beside her head. Once outside, the cold light revealed how thin she had become. Maggie covered her mouth with one gloved hand. Rosie moved closer and touched noses with the exhausted dog, offering a quiet greeting from one old soul to another. The mother and her second puppy were placed inside the warmed rescue van. Cooper followed them several steps. Then he stopped. Ahead waited the family he had nearly lost. Behind him stood Luke, muddy, breathless, and afraid to call the puppy back. Cooper looked toward the open rescue van. Then he turned his head toward the man whose voice had greeted every frightened awakening. For one long moment, the little German shepherd stood between the family he had been born into and the man who had become his first safe place. Night settled over Lake Bluff beneath a low silver sky, and the last of the melting snow darkened the roads around North Shore Veterinary Clinic. Inside the treatment room, warm lamps shone over the 2 German shepherds rescued from Miller Creek. The mother lay on several folded blankets with an intravenous line secured to one front leg. Her black and tan coat had been cleaned, revealing a graceful, narrow face, intelligent brown eyes, and the small healed tear in one ear. Exhaustion still hollowed her sides, but she no longer watched every human as though preparing for battle. Her remaining puppy slept against her abdomen, breathing with the uneven confidence of a body beginning to believe it might survive. Dr. Rachel Kim moved quietly between them, checking temperatures, listening to their hearts, and recording each small improvement. The younger puppy was dehydrated and underfed, but Rachel believed he would recover with continued fluids, warmth, and careful feeding. The mother's condition required more patience. She had lost weight, developed sores on 2 paws, and exhausted herself producing milk while receiving too little food. She can recover, Rachel told Luke, Maggie, and Emma, but medicine alone won't be enough. She needs calm, regular meals and a place where she doesn't have to guard every sound. Emma stood near the wall with both hands tucked into the sleeves of her faded green parka. The 17-year-old had washed the mud from her face, but guilt remained visible in the way her hazel eyes avoided the dogs. She had spent weeks slipping food through a gap in the building and telling herself that doing something was better than doing nothing. Now she understood how easily a partial rescue could resemble abandonment when fear kept the truth hidden. "Can Cooper stay with her?" Emma asked. "For a while," Rachel said, "as long as everyone remains calm." Cooper was already pressed against his mother's chest. The tiny German shepherd had stopped trembling the moment she recognized him. He crawled over her front leg, pushed his nose beneath her jaw, and made soft sounds that seemed too small to contain everything he had endured. The mother dog licked his face slowly, pausing whenever fatigue lowered her head. Luke stood several feet away, his tall frame motionless beside the examination table. He should have felt only relief. Cooper had found the family he remembered. The mother and second puppy were alive. Help had arrived before hunger and cold finished what neglect had begun. Instead, another feeling took shape beneath the relief. Luke watched Cooper settle between his mother and sibling and wondered whether the puppy would still turn toward him once those older bonds were restored. The thought embarrassed him. Cooper had never belonged to Luke in the first place. He was not equipment recovered from a mission or a responsibility secured by effort. He was a living creature with memories Luke could not claim, and loyalties Luke had no right to measure. Still, the possibility of returning to his silent rental house without Cooper left an emptiness Luke could already feel. Maggie noticed. Years of nursing had taught her that people often revealed fear by becoming unusually still. She stepped beside him, her short figure barely reaching his shoulder. "You look like a man waiting for test results," she said. "He found what he was searching for. That doesn't mean he has finished finding things." Luke looked at her. Maggie nodded toward Cooper. "Love is not a chair, Luke. Someone new does not have to stand because another person is already sitting down." The words sounded almost humorous, but Maggie's expression remained gentle. She understood the arithmetic of grief. After Frank died, she had behaved as though every future attachment would compete with the life they had shared. Caring for someone new had felt disloyal, as if laughter might erase a voice from memory, or warmth might insult the cold space beside her in bed. Yet watching Cooper with both his mother and Luke revealed a kinder truth. Hearts did not preserve love by remaining empty. They preserved it by learning how much more they could hold. Rachel dimmed the treatment room lights. "They need rest now." Luke moved toward the door. He did not call Cooper or offer his hand. He wanted the puppy to choose without being pulled by habit. Cooper lifted his head. For a moment he remained between the mother dog's front legs, then he climbed carefully over the blankets, crossed the floor, and reached Luke's black military boots. Cooper circled the right boot once, lowered himself across the polished toe, and rested his chin on the laces. Luke looked down, unable to speak immediately. The mother dog watched from the blankets without distress. Her eyes followed Cooper, then settled on Luke as though she, too, had reached a decision. Maggie smiled. "There appears to be room for more than one home." Luke crouched and rested his hand along Cooper's back. The puppy had not abandoned his mother by coming to him. Nor had finding his mother undone the nights Luke had fed him, carried him, and spoken from room to room so he would not wake alone. One love had not replaced another. Both were true. The following afternoon, Rachel approved the mother dog for temporary foster care, though the second puppy needed several more days of medical observation. Maggie volunteered before Luke could ask. Her house changed within an hour. Rosie greeted the mother dog beside the fireplace with calm dignity. The elderly golden retriever sniffed her face, stepped back and lay down nearby, offering companionship without pressure. Henry reacted differently. The orange tabby stared at the newcomer from the staircase, with his torn left ear angled backward and his amber eyes narrowed in personal outrage. For 3 days, Henry behaved as though Maggie had violated an ancient treaty. He ate only after dramatic hesitation, entered rooms through unnecessarily high furniture, and refused to look directly at the mother dog. On the 3rd evening, Maggie discovered him asleep at the far edge of the same rug, close enough to share the fire's warmth, but distant enough to preserve his reputation. Emma came after school each afternoon. Maggie taught her how to hide medicine inside soft food, inspect healing paws, record water intake, and notice the difference between aggression and fear. The mother dog did not snap when frightened. She turned her head away, tightened her mouth, and lowered her body as though hoping to disappear. "Fear is often quieter than people expect," Maggie told Emma. "That is why we have to learn how to listen." Emma absorbed every instruction seriously. She washed bowls, changed blankets, and sat without touching the mother dog until the animal chose to approach. Maggie never scolded her for the mistakes at Miller Creek. Shame, she knew, rarely taught responsibility as well as being trusted with the chance to do better. Soon Maggie's house filled with sounds it had not held since Frank's death. Paws crossing the kitchen floor, Emma laughing when Cooper stole a dish towel, Rosie sighing beside the stove.
and Luke's deep voice arriving at dinner time with more groceries than anyone had requested. Meals that once consisted of soup eaten alone became crowded affairs around the small oak table. One evening, Maggie opened her laptop while the mother dog slept beside Rosie. An email from the senior companionship program waited in her inbox. The message asked whether she wished to complete her return registration. Maggie looked at Rosie's silver muzzle, then at the exhausted mother dog resting safely beside her. Loving them could not guarantee that none of them would suffer. It could only guarantee that suffering would not have the final word. She moved the cursor to the confirmation box. For the first time, Maggie did not pull her hand away. She clicked, "I will participate." Early spring came cautiously to Lake Bluff, bringing cold rain, bare lawns, and a thin gray light over Naval Station Great Lakes. Luke Bennett arrived at the training building before sunrise and found a sealed envelope waiting inside his locker. His name was printed across the front, beside the insignia of a Special Operations Command. For several seconds he did not open it. He already understood what such envelopes usually contained. A destination disclosed only after acceptance, a departure date close enough to discourage second thoughts, and the promise of work in which every person knew exactly what was expected. The offer requested Luke's temporary attachment to an operational unit preparing for an overseas deployment. His experience as a Navy SEAL and instructor made him valuable, particularly in training younger operators before their first real mission. If he accepted, he would leave Lake Bluff in 3 weeks. The initial assignment would last 6 months, though experience had taught Luke that military calendars often changed whenever human hearts became foolish enough to trust them. Years earlier, the decision would have taken less than a minute. Operational work offered clear objectives, familiar risks, and the useful illusion that nothing existed beyond the next assignment. Luke had once believed freedom meant leaving no one behind who expected his return. Now the thought of giving Cooper's feeding schedule to Maggie made the rental house feel empty before Luke had even packed a bag. He folded the letter and placed it inside his uniform pocket. That morning, Cooper attended his first supervised training session at the base. The puppy was not being prepared for patrol, detection, or combat work. Luke had refused those assumptions before anyone voiced them. Cooper was still learning that doors reopened, hands could be gentle, and metal noises did not always predict pain. The training was intended only to strengthen confidence, basic obedience, and trust. The session was overseen by Chief Petty Officer Daniel Mercer, a 45-year-old canine training specialist with a compact, muscular build, dark skin, a shaved head, and a carefully shaped black beard threaded with silver. Daniel's left leg carried a slight stiffness from an injury sustained during a vehicle accident overseas. The accident had ended his field career and nearly destroyed his sense of usefulness. Working with young service members and anxious dogs had taught him that a changed purpose was not the same as a smaller one. Daniel was direct with adults, endlessly patient with animals, and possessed a dry sense of humor that appeared only when everyone else had become too serious. "He's not here to prove anything," Daniel said as Cooper inspected the rubber flooring. "Neither are you." Luke glanced at him. "I'm not the one being trained." Daniel looked toward Cooper, who had located a forgotten tennis ball beneath a bench. "That remains to be seen." The exercises began simply. Cooper followed Luke between orange cones, paused before crossing a doorway, and responded to hand signals reinforced with small pieces of chicken. His half-tilted ear moved constantly as he studied the room. When another instructor rolled a cart along the far wall, Cooper stiffened but stayed beside Luke. Luke kept the leash loose. Earlier in Cooper's recovery, every instinct had urged him to tighten his grip whenever the puppy became afraid. Daniel had explained that tension traveled directly down a leash. A person could silently tell a dog the world was dangerous while believing he was offering protection. "Trust does not mean holding tighter," Daniel said. "Sometimes it means giving enough space for the other one to choose you." Luke wondered whether Daniel was still discussing the puppy. Near the end of the session, a metal tray slipped from a counter. It struck the floor with a sharp crash that echoed through the training room. Cooper jumped sideways, his nails scraped the rubber, and his body lowered as though preparing to run. Luke felt the old impulse to reach down and gather him up, but he remained still. He gave the hand signal they had practiced at home. Cooper looked at the fallen tray, then he looked at Luke. The puppy's chest rose and fell quickly. After several seconds, Cooper stepped back into position and sat. Luke crouched and placed one hand against his shoulder. Pride moved through him with surprising force. Cooper had not become fearless. He had simply discovered that fear did not have to choose his next action. Daniel nodded. "That is enough for today." As Luke left the building, the deployment letter pressed against his chest. Cooper walked beside him, tired but confident, trusting that wherever Luke led, they would eventually return home. Across town, Maggie Lawson prepared for her first visit with the Senior Companionship Program. Rosie wore her old blue therapy dog bandana, slightly faded after years of washing. The German Shepherd mother walked beside her on a loose leash. Her strength had improved steadily. Her black and tan coat had regained some shine, though her body remained lean, and the small tear in one ear gave her an unexpectedly dignified appearance. Maggie had not yet chosen a name for the mother dog. Naming her felt too close to admitting that temporary care had already become something deeper. Their destination was Harbor Pines Veterans Residence, a brick community center serving older former service members and military spouses. The volunteer coordinator, Linda Matthews, was 63, tall and full-figured, with warm brown skin, silver-streaked curls, and reading glasses hanging from a bright red cord. Linda had spent 20 years managing grief support groups after losing her younger brother during military service. She spoke softly, but possessed the rare ability to make refusal sound like the beginning of a conversation rather than its end. "There is one resident who may not welcome visitors," Linda told Maggie. "Dorothy Hale has barely spoken since arriving." Dorothy was 82, a slender widow with pale skin, delicate hands, and white hair cut into a straight chin-length bob. Her blue eyes remained fixed on the rain beyond her bedroom window. Dorothy's husband, Samuel, had served as a Navy mechanic and died the previous winter after 56 years of marriage. Their only son lived several states away and called faithfully, but grief had convinced Dorothy that conversation was merely another way of noticing who was missing. Maggie entered without offering cheerful promises. She understood how exhausting optimism could feel when sorrow had occupied every chair in the room. Rosie settled near the doorway. The German Shepherd mother approached Dorothy slowly, paused beside the armchair, and rested her narrow head on the elderly woman's knee. Dorothy did not react at first. Then one hand moved. Her fingers entered the black and tan fur and remained there. The mother dog closed her eyes. "I had a shepherd once," Dorothy said quietly. Her voice sounded unused. "His name was Major. He stole an entire ham on Easter Sunday." Maggie sat nearby. "Did he regret it?" "Not for 1 second." Dorothy's mouth curved into the faintest smile. She began telling the story of Major hiding beneath the dining table, while Samuel attempted to maintain discipline with gravy on his uniform sleeve. Maggie did not interrupt. She did not offer advice or ask Dorothy to be brave. She simply listened while the dog remained beneath the woman's hand. On the drive home, Maggie understood that returning to the program did not require her to rescue anyone from grief. He had spent years in nursing believing care meant finding solutions. Age had taught her that some wounds did not close because another person found the correct words. Sometimes care meant bringing a gentle creature into the right room and allowing silence to soften around it. That evening, Luke joined Maggie and Emma for dinner. Cooper slept beneath the table, Rosie occupied her usual place near the stove, and the German Shepherd mother rested beside Maggie's chair. Henry watched the gathering from the refrigerator, his expression suggesting deep concern about declining standards of household management. Luke said nothing about the deployment offer. Later, back in his rental house, he removed the letter from his pocket and laid it on the kitchen table. The operational unit needed his answer by the following morning. Cooper climbed into his lap, turned twice, and rested his head against Luke's chest. The back door opened slightly.
Henry slipped inside, crossed the kitchen with complete confidence, and jumped onto the table. The orange cat examined the letter. Then Henry sat directly on top of it. Luke laughed, the sound escaping before uncertainty could stop it. Cooper lifted his head and Henry remained seated, like an official who had issued a binding ruling for the entire household. But beneath the cat's considerable weight, the offer still waited. And Luke had until morning to answer. Morning entered Luke Bennett's kitchen through a narrow band of pale gold, touching the deployment letter where Henry had left several orange hairs across the envelope. The deadline had arrived. Cooper slept beneath Luke's chair with his chin resting on one black military boot, while the house held the quiet that comes before a decision changes its shape. Luke had spent most of the night examining the offer as though it were a map with a hidden route. The assignment promised familiar work, capable people, and the kind of danger he knew how to survive. Remaining in Lake Bluff offered no such certainty. Cooper could become ill. Maggie and Rosie would grow older. Relationships could disappoint and homes could be lost without a single enemy crossing the door. For years, Luke had chosen dangerous places partly because they allowed him to call fear by simpler names. He opened his laptop and wrote his response. Luke declined the overseas assignment, but confirmed that he would remain at Naval Station Great Lakes as an instructor. He was not resigning from the Navy, or abandoning the younger service members who relied on his experience. He was choosing a form of duty that required him to remain present after the immediate crisis had passed. When Luke pressed send, Cooper opened one eye. "That was not because Henry sat on the letter," Luke said. From the windowsill, Henry stared at him with the calm satisfaction of an animal who accepted gratitude without needing it spoken. 3 weeks later, the county completed the required custody process for the Miller Creek dogs. Cooper had no registered owner willing to claim him, and the veterinarian confirmed he was healthy enough for permanent placement. Luke signed the adoption papers at North Shore Veterinary Clinic, while Cooper attempted to eat the corner of the folder. Dr. Rachel Kim rescued the paperwork before it became legally unreadable. "You understand that adoption includes food, veterinary care, training, exercise, and replacing whatever he decides belongs in his mouth." Luke glanced at the chewed folder. He has already begun the final category. Rachel smiled and handed him Cooper's identification tag. Luke attached it to a new blue collar. Cooper shook his head at the unfamiliar weight, then leaned against Luke's leg as if the document had merely confirmed what the puppy had decided beneath the porch light months earlier. The German Shepherd mother remained with Maggie. Her body filled out gradually, and her coat regained a deep black and tan shine. The guarded tension around her eyes softened as she learned the daily patterns of Maggie's house. Breakfast beside Rosie, a slow walk after sunrise, medicine hidden poorly inside cheese, and Henry's strict but inconsistent rules regarding furniture. Maggie named her Grace. The name was not chosen because the dog had behaved gracefully. Grace once backed into a flower pot, knocked over a lamp with her tail, and attempted to sit in Rosie's bed while Rosie was still occupying most of it. Maggie chose the name because the dog had arrived when all of them needed something they had not earned and could not have planned. The second German Shepherd puppy recovered fully and went to live with Emma Collins and her father. Emma named him Scout because he inspected every room before settling down. Her father initially objected to having a dog in the house, but by the end of the first week, Scout slept beside his chair and owned a blanket that cost more than any shirt Emma had ever seen him purchase. Emma began volunteering officially at North Shore Veterinary Clinic after school. She cleaned kennels, prepared food, folded towels, and learned when to ask for help. Rachel taught her that compassion without knowledge could cause harm, but knowledge without compassion rarely inspired anyone to remain when the work became unpleasant. Emma listened with the fierce attention of someone determined not to repeat an old mistake. Maggie continued visiting Harbor Pines with Rosie and Grace. Dorothy Hale began waiting near the common room window on visiting days. She still had quiet mornings when grief made conversation feel impossible, but Grace never demanded words.
The German shepherd would rest her head on Dorothy's knee while Rosie settled nearby, and Maggie would sit with them until silence no longer felt like punishment. Maggie learned that helping did not require her to repair every broken heart. Some people did not need advice. They needed another living creature to breathe beside them until the room became bearable again. Sunday dinners developed without anyone formally creating them. Luke began bringing bread. Abby brought vegetables and quietly reorganized Maggie's medicine cabinet whenever she thought no one was watching. Emma arrived with Scout and usually stayed to wash dishes.
Sarah visited from Milwaukee whenever her teaching schedule allowed, towards things about Luke's childhood. Henry attended every meal, despite receiving no invitation. The orange cat occupied whichever chair inconvenienced the most people and supervised the dogs with the authority of a neighborhood official who had never survived an election. Maggie began placing photographs on her refrigerator. The first showed the old basket beneath Luke's porch light. The second captured Cooper asleep on his boot. Others recorded Rosie beside the feeding station, Emma holding Scout outside the clinic, Grace resting her head on Dorothy's knee, and the first crowded Sunday dinner around Maggie's oak table. By early spring, Cooper had grown into a strong, healthy German shepherd, with long legs, a glossy black and tan coat, and a talent for appearing wherever Luke had placed something important. One ear finally stood upright. The other leaned slightly whenever Cooper heard an unfamiliar sound, giving him the permanent expression of someone politely questioning the wisdom of the world. Cooper still noticed metal noises, but they no longer ruled him. When a pan fell in Maggie's kitchen, he startled, looked toward Luke, and remained where he was. Fear had not disappeared. Trust had simply grown larger around it. One bright afternoon, Luke decided to take a formal photograph to send Sarah. He sat on Maggie's porch, wearing a clean uniform, while Cooper rested against his chest. Luke set his phone on a timer and attempted the serious expression expected of a military instructor. Cooper had different plans. At the exact moment the camera captured the image, Cooper turned and licked Luke across the chin. Luke's eyes widened, his mouth opened in surprise, and Cooper faced the camera with a joyful expression that made the young German shepherd appear entirely pleased with himself. Sarah replied within seconds, "That is the most honest photograph you have ever taken." Maggie printed it and placed it in the center of her refrigerator. It became photograph number 8. That evening, she removed the picture and wrote on the back, "Luke thought he had rescued a puppy. Cooper thought he had merely found a warm pair of boots to sleep on. But during those nights of waking every 2 hours, two lonely souls learn the same thing. Love does not arrive in one grand moment. It comes through a bottle, an opened door, and someone deciding to still be there in the morning." Outside, early spring sunlight spread across the yard. Cooper ran between Rosie and Grace, circling the two older dogs with more enthusiasm than direction. Scout chased him along the fence, while Henry watched from the porch railing, visibly disappointed by the general lack of discipline. Luke stood beneath the porch light, where the old basket had once waited. For years he had entered every new place by quietly locating the nearest road out. It had been an old survival habit, useful long after the danger had ended. This time, Luke did not look behind him. He watched Cooper racing through the sunlight, Maggie laughing near the garden, and the chairs being carried outside for another Sunday meal. Luke was looking toward the place where he belonged. Luke believed courage meant walking toward danger, but Cooper taught him that sometimes the braver choice is staying. Staying through fear. Staying through uncertainty. Staying when love gives us something precious enough to lose. From a human point of view, it is easy to admire dramatic rescues while overlooking the quiet work that follows. Real compassion is rarely one heroic moment. It is waking every 2 hours, opening the door again, asking for help when kindness alone is not enough, and refusing to abandon someone when caring becomes inconvenient. Perhaps that is how many of God's miracles enter our lives, not with thunder, but through a trembling puppy, an elderly neighbor, an unexpected friendship, or a small responsibility that slowly restores a wounded heart. God may not always remove our fear, but He can place someone beside us who teaches us that fear does not have to lead. May this story remind us that no heart is too old, too tired, or too broken to become a home again. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments what Cooper's journey meant to you, and subscribe for more stories of courage, mercy, and second chances. May God protect you, strengthen your heart, and bless your home with love.